have to think about a form of racism called institutional racism. And we're going to do that by taking a look at redlining specifically. And so to do that, what I want you to do is to take a look at some videos. There are 3 separate videos that there are links listed on the slide about what is redlining. It's best if you watch those because they provide the basic information about what redlining is, how it happened, and who was responsible for it, and then talks a little bit about some of the implications. So watch those videos, and then we can talk. I can sort of guide us through how to think about these things. And of themselves actually do a pretty good job of doing that. And then I just have a few other points I want to add to it for us to think about how it might link to some of the things we've already been talking about. Okay, so now I'm assuming that you've actually seen the redlining videos. You can always review those again as you want. But one of the important things to recognize, it's pointed out relatively early on, is that redlining by the federal government. The federal government in the 1934 Fair Housing Act, as we saw in the videos, was responsible for coming up with the color coding on the maps to talk about the risk level. And on some level, there is a concern when you're talking about lending money for housing. Buying a house is an expensive thing, obviously. We now have 30-year mortgages. They haven't always had those instruments, but there are certainly ways in which to pay for a house, you need to take the payments and spread them out over a long period of time. But then there's also risk that the individuals won't be able to pay it back. And so there are real risks to the banks and the entire banking 2008 Great Recession. That was a housing crisis that spilled over into many areas of American society, and not just the United States, it was the entire world. That there were some countries that are able to avoid it. In fact, Australia hasn't had a recession in over 2.5 decades. That's a separate question. Anyways, the main thing is to say that the federal government might have had some justification for talking about whether or not neighborhoods were a good investment or not. That makes a lot of sense. But because the government used primarily race as an indication for the color coding that was used, and redlining is that the drawing of a red line on a map, was the neighborhoods, or the neighborhoods that were identified as such were those that had African Americans and other minorities as part of it. And in those, they were designated as higher risk, and therefore banks were less likely to loan to individuals in order to buy a house. So there was a lot lower home ownership, and we'll talk a little bit about the implications of that. But once the United States government came up with that ranking system, then it was the banks who actually followed that and used that to decide to whom they would actually lend money and what sort of terms they would do, and what the interest rates might be, and if they would want a premium to be able to loan to people who are higher risk. And so moving on to the implications of the system of redlining is that African Americans and Latinos and other minority groups in society couldn't get access to the suburbs. The suburbs were places that had life. You had more area to have your kids play, and it was much safer and things like that. But the other thing is, an economic aspect, is that home ownership is the primary wealth for most Americans. And so if certain groups in society don't have access to that, don't have access to a house that is an important investment and a way to transfer wealth from one generation to the other, then certainly you create this economic inequality by a government action to decide that certain neighborhoods would be deemed problematic and difficult to loan to. And so that decision then created this economic wealth gap that is incredibly important to sort of the life consequences for continuing onwards. In addition to that, you would also have that because the government would use the presence of Americans in a neighborhood as a way of designating a neighborhood as becoming yellow, or even worse, to be red, then it created this system of white flight. And I grew up outside of Chicago, which is one of the epicenters of the instance of white flight. White flight from the urban areas to the suburbs created, as we saw in the videos, for those who were lucky enough to go to the suburbs, it created a wealth for themselves. It also generated communities that were safer and had better schools, and then could have individuals be able to pass on not just important life skills and education to their children. But white flight also had an impact for the neighborhoods where the whites left, and that whites left the urban areas, the tax bases for those urban neighborhoods dropped considerably. Urban schools declined in quality because they became starved of funds. Most places in the United States, it's property taxes, local property taxes from businesses and from private property from homeowners that pays for the schools. And so those places that don't have as many resources don't have the resources for the schools. And as we saw when we talked about Brown versus Board of Education, the ways in which the resources available at a huge impact in terms of the lives of the people who go there, but also the larger society. The city services for those in the neighborhoods declined, and so it creates this negative knock-on effect for those who are able to escape through white flight, that they actually were able to access a better life, but the places where they left, those neighborhoods became starved of funds, and it created a negative downward spiral. And this is what institutional racism looks like. And even if people themselves are individually not racist or ethnocentric, there can still be racist effects and outcomes. And as you saw in the first video, there certainly was a lot of overt racism. There were in a number of places, including in Long Beach and Lakewood and places around here, that said you were not allowed, that the deed said you were not allowed to sell this property to an African American. But even if you don't have that animosity, that individual level animosity towards the individuals, there can still be the impact of the decisions could have racist and ethnocentric outcomes. And as we saw in the Larry Wilmore piece, that it's still ongoing today. Discrimination is not simply something that was done in the past, and therefore there are people who are like, well, I wasn't alive then. It's not my fault. They weren't my choices. I'm not that way. Why should I make up for past wrongs? But the argument is as you saw in the Larry Wilmore, is that there are still ways in which there are distinctions that are made, and that certain types of loans are made to certain groups and things like that. But even if that weren't going on, and it certainly is terrible that it is, but even if that weren't, is that the decisions made back in 1934 and then continuing through the decades still has implications today. It's not that we're making up for past wrongs necessarily. It is that the outcomes are still negative for certain groups in society. And therefore, for people who would like to address those, then the government needs to come in and make some important decisions about how to rectify this situation that are there. And so some argue that it demands important changes to all aspects of society and economics. And just as we saw with Brown versus about things like education or things like housing that are fundamental to how people live their lives and the freedoms that it's asking quite a bit from a government to be able to go in and do that. And some ideologically are just opposed to the idea of giving the government that much authority. The other is that the government itself, by getting that much power, could abuse that power in attempting to do it. And others argue that to deal with this issue, to come up with ways of making the place more equal economically, it will necessarily infringe of individual education, that people were opposed to busing, for example, because they didn't want to send their children to a school across town, even if the benefits are there for society. And there was clear evidence that, as we saw in the John Oliver piece on school segregation, that in fact busing works. It's still a debate that goes on with the Democratic Party. It's one that the nominees for the President of the United States have some differing opinions on. Busing does work. It is actually an effective means of achieving higher levels of equality. But at the same time, there are also real implications for individuals in terms of very basic decisions about where you send your kids for school, where you live, what sort of house you have, and things like that. And so people are particularly concerned about those things. And all of this is a reminder of something we said very early on, back when we talked about in the chapter on civil liberties, the distinction between civil liberties and civil rights, is the idea that civil rights demands a lot more of our government in order to achieve it. But it's also a reminder from back when we talked about in chapter 1 that there are often trade-offs between the idea of the democracy standard, between equality, in this case economic equality, and trying to achieve some form of economic equality that is going to be fairly difficult to achieve, but it will have a negative impact in terms of individual liberties. And so political liberties is another part of the democracy standard. clear-cut solutions to this, and it's really not the point of this class to tell you how you have to think. And so I'm not advocating any particular position. Instead, it's just to think about what are the underlying trade-offs. If you see the situation and you do believe the government should get involved, or if you think the government shouldn't get involved, there are still reasons for those positions.